Jesus gets a little spicy in the gospel this weekend. In the passage that we hear, Jesus is speaking to the chief priests and the elders, and he gives them a little parable, and then he says to them at the end of that parable, there are tax collectors and prostitutes entering the kingdom of God before you. Now that's kind of Jesus's way of saying, yeah, I know tax collectors and prostitutes who are better people than you. Like, it's a challenge to them to get their act together, because the tax collectors and the prostitutes were among the most despised of all peoples in Jesus's time. The prostitutes, because there's a shamefulness in the way that they live, and they're degrading marriage, they're degrading the meaning of sex and sexuality. And the tax collectors were hated, they were despised by the people because they were corrupt. They were probably the most corrupt person that your ordinary citizen would have run into. And they were having regular encounters with the tax collectors, and they just hated them. And maybe the worst among them would have been the Jew who works as a tax collector, because they're working for the government who's oppressing the Jews, and there's this betrayal now of the Jews as well. So it's interesting to me that this passage is written in the Gospel of Matthew. Remember what Matthew did. Matthew was a tax collector. Of course, Matthew remembers these words by Jesus. This moment when Jesus is highlighting the fact that tax collectors and prostitutes ought to be imitated. Matthew's story, I think, is just beautiful. It's a simple little conversion story that we hear. It's only a few verses long in his gospel. But I love how Caravaggio captures it in his painting. We see the calling in the painting, the calling of St. Matthew. Matthew's hunched over his money. He's sitting in a dark room, hunched over his money. There's a group of others around him. And Jesus has stepped into the room, and the only light in the room is coming from behind Jesus. It's now this shaft of light cutting across the room and highlighting Matthew. And Jesus is pointing at him, calling him to follow Jesus. And Matthew is hunched over his money like he's torn, right? He's been giving his life to riches, to the worldly way of life. And yet Jesus' words are speaking something in his being, speaking something in his heart. And he feels this invitation out of the darkness of his life, out of this spiritual darkness, to follow the Lord. And we know that that's exactly what he does. Jesus is inviting us to imitate the tax collectors and the prostitutes, not because we should be imitating their sin, of course. It's because we're supposed to be imitating their humility, their acknowledgement that they are sinners, that they are in desperate need of God's forgiveness. They're willing to acknowledge their sins and turn to Jesus for mercy. This is what the tax collectors and the prostitutes had over the chief priests and the elders. The chief priests and the elders thought that they were pretty good people. How many of us would say, yeah, pretty good person, right? If we're in that place where we think that we're a pretty good person, we need to do a serious examination of conscience, because Jesus does not praise us for that. He praises us if we acknowledge that we're sinners, if we acknowledge that we need the Lord's mercy. So yeah, Jesus' words in the gospel this weekend might be kind of hard to hear if we think that we're pretty good people. But he's going to say it to us anyway, because he wants to bring us out of the darkness into the light. God bless you.